So I know what you're thinking. Dylan, the movie's already been out for like over a week. Why are you even still talking about it? Anything you have to say about it is irrelevant. Well, I recorded this footage. It's like 50 minutes of footage that I cut down to like a little under half an hour or something. I don't know. I haven't looked at the full running time yet. But in any case, I don't need an excuse to talk about this. What I want to talk about, I'm eventually going to see the movie in question. If you have a problem with that, you can go suck a fat.
This week, we'll see the release of a blockbuster adaptation of the young adult hit Ready Player One. 7 words in that sentence would ordinarily keep me from talking about this at all. I mean, I've spent a good chunk of my life rolling my eyes at these things, many of them a clear attempt to capitalize off the success of what I'm referring to as the Big Three, those being Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, and Twilight. One's a social outcast's wet dream, told through a fantastical British lens. One reignited a whole genre of teens fight the power stories in a sorta gritty yet decidedly not all the way ballsy style, and one captured the hearts of countless young women, while pissing off pretty much everybody else. And since the release of these 3 series, there's been an endless string of inspired properties and flat-out knockoffs that vary dramatically in quality, let me tell you. And while I wouldn't necessarily vow to never watch any of them, none of them come close to being a priority in my ever-growing queue of things I need to see or read or listen to before I die. And yet, I'm totally seeing this in theaters. Let's be real here. I may not have read Ernest Cline's original book, but I am a cinephile in his early 20s, a part-time pop culture junkie who grew up with countless stories of heroes, villains, and adventure, set in space, or the jungle, or in the future, or in the past, or in New Zealand. And this movie was quite literally designed to appeal to all of the affection for stuff I adore. So for all my open and one-sided disdain for those other stories I mentioned, at the end of the day, I'm not really that against a populist piece of entertainment, or even the odd guilty pleasure that panders to my most basic sensibilities. For me, what separates this title from others like it are 2 things. First, the production. All these game and movie references may be copious, and the story will probably follow a lot of the usual templates of young adult fiction I just touched on, but that trailer, with its loving homage to a fairy tale staple, breakneck pacing, and coherently beautiful imagery, tells me that this movie seems to have had a lot of love and effort put into it, at least as a theatrical experience. Which brings me to my second bullet point. Steven Spielberg. The man has one of the best track records in cinema history, both as a director and a producer. His name's attached to some of the most iconic, but more importantly, most fun films of all time. And yet he's also demonstrated a remarkable talent in bringing more adult stories to life while infusing them with that same spark of humanity that makes his bigger films resonant with people all over the world. At his best, you either get white-knuckle standards like Jaws or Raiders of the Lost Ark, or dramatic masterworks like Lincoln or Schindler's List. And yet having said that, at the guy's worst, you get ambitious misfires like AI or 1941, or Hook. Fucking Hook. My point is, even if Ready Player One doesn't measure up to the guy's best, it should at the very least provide a fun night at the movies, with stunning images and immersive sound and music that'll rattle my senses. That's what I'm going for, at least. But hey, let's move on from the formalities of analyzing a movie that, at the time of this recording, isn't even out yet. Let's talk about nerds. Now, I addressed the tip of this iceberg in my review of Netflix's Death Note movie. With your typical run-of-the-mill adaptation, you run the risk of infuriating that property's original fanbase, misrepresenting the characters, missing the point of the story, throwing in a bunch of bullshit that commits the double sin of not being in the original and being uninteresting. There are plenty of things that can and have gone wrong whilst bringing one of these stories to the screen. And yet, on the flip side, a lot of the criticism that you'll see from these people will raise nitpicking to a motherfucking art form, where they spend less time seeing how the movie handles the material and stands as its own work, and instead opt to skim through their own personal checklist of what should be there. Meanwhile, the things that I value in a film, like art direction, pacing, shot composition, or acting, those can be middling or just flat out terrible. But if it hits all those familiar notes, those little visual cues that they liked in the other thing,
You know, that movie was actually pretty good. It felt just like the original. They did the thing from the show, but they also did the thing from the mangoes. And then at this part, they played the theme song.
That's a great way to break a pair of expensive headphones. What makes Ready Player One interesting, though, is that the original text itself has been very divisive in the nerdosphere of pop culture, despite being a critical and financial success. Some have sung its praises for having its finger on the pulse of a generation, while others have charged it with simply pandering and exploiting its most superficial quirks. Critics have called it a step forward in genre storytelling, while critics... not not the same people, like the people who don't like the thing, have deemed it a trashy regurgitation of overused tropes and cliches. Some scholars have praised its sociological ambition, touting it Harry Potter for grown-ups. Aw, no. There is no quicker way to piss off a good chunk of the Earth's population. Like, I'm not even a Harry Potter fan, but you can't do that. That's just so fucking condescending, man. Which in a roundabout sort of way does bring me to the layman, the dorks this mammoth was stitched together for. And by. But stuff like that doesn't matter when there's money involved, am I right? Am I right? I get it, of course, I'm joking. All bets are off when that money is going towards a prophetic visionary, who in reality is just an easy-to-please basement-dwelling fanboy. Anyone worth their salt knows that a true artist would never succumb to their basic impulse to just mash a bunch of shit that they like onto a canvas and call it expression. No, that would be the death of art and culture, and we nerds have much higher standards than that. So back to what I'm saying, the broader movie-going public has also been quite a schismed demographic in regards to Ready Player One, with one half hyped to see all the stuff they loved as a kid crammed into one movie, the others disgusted to see all the stuff they loved as a kid crammed into one movie. I loosely lump myself into the former category, knowing full and well that this thing's probably not going to crack my top 20 or even top 100 list of movies. Ultimately, I expect it to be a popcorn film, for better and worse. And honestly, I can empathize with the kind of skepticism attached to this kind of product, the admittedly corporate way in which they grab a bunch of recognizable properties to use in the story. However, what peeps me off about this particular case is the high level of dead-on-arrival sentencing cropping up around this movie. The sure-footed declarations that it won't be good, can't be good, and that all people attached to the project should be ashamed of its very creation. In conjunction with this are the sectors of geekdom taking shots at the book and the film on the grounds that it bastardizes their pastime and the characters therein. A lot of it comes down to the idea that Ernest Cline and the production team have made a large-scale piece of masturbatory fanfiction, banking off of other people's creations for a mishmash that appeals to the lowest common denominator through flashy spectacle and fan service. And honestly, you know what? That's a great point. Whoever heard of something that unimaginative happening in something as grassroots and dignified as video game culture? Punchline. Don't misunderstand me. Fan service can be annoying, and trying to slam as many recognizable elements into one work should never be your priority, but the act in and of itself can actually be done quite well. You could argue that the very concept of Super Smash Bros. Is as shallow as you could get creatively, but it's become a AAA franchise because the crossover was only a piece of the puzzle for a loving and stimulating fighting game whose developers take their fans relatively seriously. Take away that latter portion and you just end up with something else. As for filmmaking, I'd like to remind everyone that one of the most cherished pieces of millennial nostalgia is a little film called Space Jam, the crown jewel of any top 10 list that only 90s kids will understand. And that movie's trash. I still like it. I have plenty of fond memories watching it as a kid, along with, you know, Good Burger. But in retrospect, it's one of the weirdest, most awkward attempts of capitalizing off of pre-existing shit I've ever seen. And even if the optimist in me says that it produces its own unique, naive charm watching it in 2018, I can't comfortably call it a good movie at this stage in my life. But on the opposite side of that coin, you've got an often overlooked movie from the 1980s. Who Framed Roger Rabbit? A wacky cornucopia of classic cartoon characters that were licensed from all the major studios, a feat that blows minds even today. Despite having the same cash-grabby presence of so many old properties, it's become a classic of the era for being a technical marvel and having an inspired take on old film noir cliches. All this to say, something like Ready Player One isn't destined to fail simply because of what it is on paper. And from what I've seen, all the animosity towards the central idea is unfairly bleeding into preemptive criticism for things like flat characterization, poorly handled relationships and missing the original point of certain characters. Even though you can see all that shit in movies that were made as recent as 1 or 2 years ago, let alone whatever other geeky shit has been immortalized before that. And I don't recall there being nearly as much outcry for that stuff. Sure, there's the argument that we have the power to be more forward-thinking and progressive with what we consume, especially now that we're grown adults. But for me personally, there's nothing less adult than boycotting something entirely because parts of it might be problematic. And I just want to remind everyone that that word, yeah, while valid, it's pretty subjective. Last Temptation of Christ has modern revisionist themes in it. Come on, other regressive mothers with too much time on their hands. Let's boycott it. Now, let's address the culture built around video games, comics, anime, and the like. One so passionate about begotten eras and so willing to pay tribute to their interests through literature, retrospectives, music, cosplaying, and design. It's not always the most refined thing in the world, but I'm really glad it exists, and I do enjoy going to an odd convention here and there myself. So why, with all this pageantry and shared interest around something so blatantly nostalgic, are we suddenly going to draw the line at a mainstream motion picture that happens to be about video games, directed by one of the most talented directors that we currently have? In my eyes, a lot of this naysaying comes from an unspoken possessiveness that can be seen in all fandoms. In this particular case is all the louder because there seems to be this idea that Ready Player One is being made as video games the movie, the be-all end-all representation of an entire art form and hobby. I'll admit, the marketing isn't doing the movie any favors in regards to that angle of criticism. I don't know who the fuck approved of this blurb in particular, but it's like inventing a film critic who doesn't exist and then adding their stamp onto the movie before it's out. Why, guys? And to be perfectly fair, yeah, there is something a little weird about the fact that Spielberg's directing a movie that pays homage to like half of the guy's filmography. So if I had to point a finger at something being even a little masturbatory, it would probably be that. It's a weird thing you're doing, Steve. But from what I've gathered from what's out there, it seems to be less of a summation of the gamer and more of a conventional hero story in a science fiction setting aimed at millennials with the pure aesthetic bonus of licensed properties and character models from gaming and movie history. You know, all the cool shit that we nerds spent years being passionate about. The stuff that years of devotion has unlocked the hidden layers to. All that beauty distilled and repackaged for those fucking normies. I can relate to dude bro randos liking something I'm passionate about for the most surface level reasons. Hey dude, you see the new Blade Runner? Yeah, it was one of my favorite movies of the year. I thought it really redefined what you can do with big concept sci-fi while still making something that's, you know, palatable for a mainstream audience. Wasn't that hologram bitch fucking hot? But at the end of the day, I'm of the belief that more people liking this sort of thing makes the world a little brighter, a little closer, a little more susceptible to the simple joys in life. Which is interesting because when you look back at that big video game thing that broke the fucking internet, one of the central arguments was whether or not video games should be a more inclusive community. And no matter who you thought won that epic battle, even though nobody fucking won, you'd have to be delusional to think otherwise. God, what a goddamn mess. I think we can all agree that video gaming is a beautiful thing that anyone with a functional pair of eyes can enjoy. So yeah, you should try to include more people, regardless of who they are, where they come from, what age they are, what gender they are, what race they are. Just let everyone have fun. But the awkward, inconvenient extension of this idea is that we should probably be a little less against the idea of a tentpole blockbuster that happens to be about video games and references actual real-world properties. I don't know.
So I've been playing video games from the invention of video games. But I wanted to make a movie that didn't require people to have played video games or have any knowledge of video games to be able to really go on this ride.
I mean, it's happening for hardcore sci-fi like Star Trek and Star Wars, and it's happening with more obscure comic books like Deadpool, as much as some people seem to be really against that for some reason. I hate this meme. I hate it so fucking much. Again, 101 fans gushing over 101 details of something I really like, yeah. I can understand why that would get old. But hey, at least it's one less person looking down on the whole thing simply because there's no ball or money involved.
When I was a little kid, we watched Batman on TV because we wanted to be tough and fight bad guys. Now you're 32 and you're sitting there, I'm Batman, I'm Superman, I can fly. Look at my Wolverine shirt. He has claws. You read comic books? That is for people who are special, okay? In the old days, you lived in the basement because you were mentally handicapped. When we saw 12-year-olds playing Star Wars with 9-year-olds, we went, poor bastard, oh well. I guess he'll be living with his mommy forever.
But what's the true cherry on top of the Ready Player One sundae? I'd say minor as an issue as it might be, objectively speaking. It's the fact that none of us have read the original book that the fucking movie's based on. Hype boys, detractors, pop speculators, general mouth-breathing plebs. Hey, what the fuck? We've all developed impassioned stances on this thing in the months leading up to its wide release as a major motion picture, but all the while, the most we have to go off of is the word of people who did read the original text.
Ah, swoon. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It is totally me and totally emblematic of a time and place.
Yeah, I heard it was like the greatest book of all time, therefore it's gonna be the best movie of all time. Oh, shit's gonna be so fucking epic. I read a passage online and it was like the most cringy, regressive trite I've ever read. Shit's gonna blow.
Really, I honestly can't say I read it or nothing, but I follow a guy online. He said it sucks ass. So, I guess it sucks ass.
Look, you're well within your right to form an early impression of something before its release. I do it all the fucking time. But it's also important to keep yourself open to the possibility that it might work well enough to be worth checking out. And nothing bugs me more than this committee-like bullshit where a piece of art, no matter how high or low the budget or concept, is given the A-OK or the scarlet letter by those allegedly woke enough to do that sort of thing. No thanks, guys. I'm gonna wait till the movie drops, and even if there's no objective guarantee of whether it's gonna be amazing or even any good, I have a hunch that it's gonna be much more rewarding than this. Or this. Most certainly this. But hey, maybe that's just the normie in me talking. It's some good brew. Mirkwood didn't happen like this. I would know. I read it as a kid, so I was basically there with them in their quest to get the treasure back from Smaug. Bad creative choice, Peter Jackson, director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Bad creative choice. One of many, but this is definitely the most egregious of them. You hack. I get Tolkien.